In this week's episode of the Dairyland Initiative podcast, we're going to be talking about managing sand bedding in dairy cattle stalls.
Hi, I'm Courtney Hallbach,
And I'm Nigel Cook,
and this is the Dairyland Initiative podcast,
where we get to discuss issues related to the housing and management of dairy cattle.
Let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of the Dairyland Initiative podcast. We're going to talk about one of your favorite topics today, and
Please let it end.
yeah, please. Is it over yet?
Yeah.
But I'm hoping to get some background information about how you've become known as the Sandman.
The Sandman. It's true. We're going to complete our discussion of why we think deep loose bedding is best for dairy cows, with a major focus on sand bedding.
I've heard this before.
And we've promised our viewer that we'll get back to calves soon. So I'm hoping our next episode will be back to Courtney in her starring role and be talking about baby calf housing.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. But let's finish this discussion and why sand is so important for cows.
It is. And we've set this up over our previous episodes. And we've dealt with changing stalls, improving cow behavior, putting sand bedding into lots of dairies. And in this episode, we're trying to focus on how to manage it.
Makes sense because, America, especially Wisconsin, we've really taken off in implementing sand usage. But then when I talk to people in other parts of the world, it's really there's a hurdle. And
yeah, it's a
how do you
big
overcome
difference just putting a little sawdust over a flat mat or mattress surface versus daily managing a deep bed of sand or other materials.
And, not to mention where do you get it from, wear and tear on equipment, and so on. So,
Right. Well, there are benefits to the cow, and we've talked about those in other episodes, but focus here on less lameness. Over the studies that we had available to us 15 years ago, we had evidence that there was 42% less lameness in herds with sand, and we tried to work out why that was, and it was really related a lot to cow behavior changes.
Yep, cow comfort.
Yep, and we had fewer hock lesions, both in freestalls and tie stalls with sand bedding compared to mattress surfaces, so less hair loss and injury over the hocks.
And that's good for the well-being of the animals, but then also as these welfare concerns come up, that is something welfare audits are looking at. Sure,
and that's important, but also important to the farmer is productivity and profitability. And sand-bedded herds in surveys of our Wisconsin dairy industry, we've got DHI data here, showing about a 7 pound per cow per day difference in energy-corrected milk between the sand herds and the mattress herds.
That's quite a significant difference and definitely pays for anything that you would have to change in order to implement sand.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps offset some of the extra costs of handling sand, and that milk is referenced to improved fresh cow health, improved milk production in early lactation, lower somatic cell count, so improved udder health, and a little lower turnover rate, so hopefully more controlled removal of cows and better control of overall culling.
So what do you do if you currently have mattresses?
You convert. And you can
say that convincingly.
Yeah, there's quite a lot involved in changing over. Actually, relative to the stall conversion, that's somewhat simple relative to the manure handling conversion that you have to go through.
So have you done a few of these in the past?
We've done a few, repouring curbs and completely removing the platform, adding different bedding retainers, fiberglass pipes, angle irons. This is a treated timber, arsenic treated timber, so it doesn't rot as quickly as normal wood. And so we fashioned different retainers to hold the sand bedding in the stalls. So those conversions often are dealing with sand over the existing concrete platform. But really the best approach is to remove that concrete platform, and when we're building new facilities, have a big deep bed of sand.
Because how do you deal with drainage if you...
Drainage is key,
Yeah.
absolutely. So in our typical installs, we'll have about 18 inches of sand depth over whatever we have below, and that's usually an earthen layer, or in some locales you'll be restricted in terms of having to manage seepage of urine and so on, and so there'll be a sort of membrane system, as you can kind of see here, with a tile drainage below, so there'll be some way of managing that seepage of urine through the stalls. But we're really kind of dealing with a big deep layer of sand to allow that drainage.
And for people that don't want to deal with that much sand, what other options are there?
Yeah, there are other options, and various manufacturers will like to sell what they call bedding retainers, which are often a sort of plastic grid. And I haven't been a huge supporter of those because, yes, they help retain sand, but they also retain urine and fecal matter, and over about a 2-year period you start to see an erosion of the quality of the sand and the depth of sand with those types of devices. But one bedding retainer option, a sand reducer option that we've used is what we call the pack mat. And that's using a standard rubber crumb filled mattress pad and putting that over a bed of lime screenings compacted down, so that when you put that mattress pad over the top and complete the layer with a permeable cover over the top of that, and leave about a 2-inch gap from the cover to the top of the curb, and that allows you to manage about 2 inches of sand over a mattress surface. So you're reducing your sand usage by about 50% in this scenario, and just managing a small layer of sand over the top of that structure. And that has worked reasonably well.
I was just going to say, you were just saying 18 inches of sand in the previous point, and now 2 inches. Are you still getting the same benefit?
You still have to, frequently fill sand to maintain that sand level. But yes, 2 to 3 inches of sand over that mattress seems to perform as well as a deep bed, and gives you some options, particularly for smaller herds, in terms of manure handling. Less sand to buy, but less sand to deal with in the manure handling system. So over the course of several years, we've seen about 2/3 of our dairy industry utilize sand bedding. And when we do surveys, we see a little growth in manure solids as a deep bed, and we'll deal with that in a future episode. But still predominantly in Wisconsin, seeing a lot of sand usage. And we go to different parts of the world and we'll see different materials being used. But here in the upper Midwest, sand is still king.
And where are we getting our sand from?
We'll use it, we'll manufacture sand. Sometimes it's riverbed sand, sometimes it's sand out of hillsides, so a variety of different sources, but a lot of manufactured sand.
Yeah.
The bigger herds in our environment, usually above 1,000 cows, will tend to recycle the sand. And so at some point you have to start to get concerned about the amount of sand that's being shipped out onto your land. It will change the nature of the soil, and we're fortunate we have sort of very heavy clay soils which take a lot of sand, and actually the sand improves the soil. But you do get to a point in some locations where you have to control the amount of sand going out on the land, and so recycling becomes very important. In our industry, about 20% of the herds are recycling sand.
Do you see that growing in the future?
Very likely, as we see more larger herds, they will have to recycle sand and reclaim sand out of the manure stream.
And the manure stream. What do you do
Where
with
does it go?
sand-laden manure?
Yeah. So in smaller herds, we're still putting sand-laden manure into a manure lagoon. and often our manure lagoons are earthen walled, and so it's difficult to get the sand out of those lagoons. And we'll see these kind of salamander devices floating out on lagoons, remote controlled, and they're sort of agitating.
I can see that every guy's dream is just got
my son would like to do this for a living. But those devices go out and they agitate the lagoon and bring up that sand from the bottom so that they can actually transport that out of the lagoon system. This concrete wall here is called a weep wall, and it divides this lagoon into two. And on one side there's a concrete floor, and there's access for heavy equipment to go in and scoop the sand out of the bottom of the lagoon when they empty it. And on the other side, you see the sort of more liquid organic matter being held in an earthen sided lagoon system. So very common in our smaller herds to see a two-stage lagoon system with a weep wall.
But what about for our larger herds?
Larger herds are really, again, into the recycle game, and there's two main ways of recycling sand out of the manure stream. You can do it with a settling lane system, which is usually a 200 or 300 foot long dual lane concrete floored system where we're trickling the sand laden manure along at about a slow 1 feet per second in terms of the speed. So it's just trickling along, and it allows the sand to settle in the lane, and you go in with your skid steers and scoop it out.
But you need a lot of space for this.
Need space, and it's a bit smelly, so you don't need too many neighbors close by. So more common, or about half of the systems we're seeing are mechanical systems that are enclosed within a building, and you'll see a device like this that is basically mixing water with sand-laden manure, and when you get a 50-50 mix, the sand will settle. It kind of breaks the gel-like matrix of the manure. The sand settles, and you pull that out with an auger system, and then you recycle the organics and the rest of the liquid.
And we have one of those types. We have a mechanical system at our Arlington facility. Yeah,
this is our very own sand reclamation system. You see that in the building here with the sand separator. The machine here creating a pile of recycled sand, and that pile will be generally moved and stored for 3 to 7 days before it's recycled back into the stalls. But to get that bit to work, you need water. So again, once you get that 50-50 mix of water and sand-laden manure, you get the sand to separate. Where does the water come from? You'll go broke if you're pumping that out of a well, because it takes a lot of water. And so the complexity of these systems is to create water out of the manure. And so you'll see an organic separator in line, and that is creating clean enough water from the manure stream to be stored and to feed back into the sand separator. So when you go into these buildings, there are so many moving parts, but that's really what we're trying to do, is develop a closed loop system where you're creating water out of the manure stream, separating the organic solids to do that, and then separating the sand.
And now, where do you store this separated sand? You just said, you let it sit for a week or so. Yeah,
preferably in a building in Wisconsin, because one of the problems of sand settling lanes is freezing in the winter. It is, because it's wet, it is susceptible to freezing. And actually, some of our farms with sand settling lanes will have just a simple coverall building where they can store sand separated for winter usage to get by. Otherwise, we're building an enclosed shed where the sand is stored within that shed. We have not addressed fecal oral pathogens.
I was going to say, there's some. Aren't we concerned a little bit about pathogens?
Yeah, so things like salmonella have not been killed within this process. The killing that takes place would really be from drying to this point. But with other concerns going on related to infectious agents in the dairy industry right now, H5N1, things like that, people have to take the control of fecal oral pathogens seriously, as they do these other problems. And that means that we've sort of added systems to this basic separation to deal with that, because the separated sand will have a biofilm around the sand particles. And so these are electron micrographs from our friend Keith Bolson from WVDL and Don Socket. Fresh sand, you can kind of see, has no bacteria associated with it. It's inert, sterile almost. Whereas this used sand has these little bacteria all attached to it in a biofilm around each of the particles. And so to break that biofilm, we either have to agitate it, dry it completely, or add a chemical like chlorine dioxide to help disinfect the material. And so we see on some farms agitation tanks mixing with chlorine dioxide, or spray systems. Here's a spray system coming off a receptacle here, spraying the separated sand as it comes off, to try to break that biofilm and kill those pathogens that are attached to the sand.
Have you been called out to any farms that haven't implemented this, that have had problems with recycled sand?
From time to time, not too commonly, but from time to time we've seen outbreaks of salmonella that have been associated with not taking these extra steps.
Okay.
And others have spent even more money and gone to the point of using dryer equipment to dry the reclaimed sand to very dry levels, so less than 2% moisture with these types of systems.
But this is really on very large herds at the moment.
This would be, this particular example would be a 5,000 cow dairy with a cross-ventilated barn where they're using evaporative cooling, so that these barns run with the high rates of humidity, so very humid air, so making it very difficult for the sand to dry in the barn. And so they've gone to the extra step of drying it before they put it in the stalls.
You've highlighted a couple of technologies that are out there, and just recently we've seen some new companies come onto the United States market.
Yeah, we've got three main manufacturers of sand reclamation equipment, and they've been joined by a fourth just recently. And this is a company out of Denmark that is in the sort of human sewage business. So, big experienced company, and it's kind of exciting to see a little bit of new technology hitting the marketplace with pretty effective results. There's a picture here of new and recycled sand, and it's very difficult to tell which is the new and which is the recycled. This is actually the recycled one, which looks even cleaner than the fresh sand in this scenario. So I think the big difference here is we're actually getting an agitation and a washing process, which again I think is breaking that biofilm. And so, for the first time in a long time, we're seeing a little bit of new technology related to sand reclamation, which is exciting for someone like me.
Yeah, very exciting.
Very easily pleased.
Yeah.
Very easily pleased. Well, if you put sand into a stall, how do you manage it in the cow barn? We've dealt with the boring bit of the manure management, which you have to deal with.
I don't think that's that boring. Maybe to some.
It's perspective.
Yeah.
But how do you deal with it in the stall beds to make it the best it can be for our dairy cows?
Well, I think that leads to what type of sand do you use?
It really starts with that. The type of sand is extremely important. And this is two types of manufactured sand, what we call a mason or concrete sand, and a number 8 sand, which will be very commonly used in manufacturing. And this is just showing the consequences of putting this material through a screen. So there are different US screen sizes that we use. Little bit like a colander that you use to shake off your lettuce and clean that. We can put sand through a separator and separate it out onto different layers depending on the hole size. And so as you go down here, the holes get smaller and smaller. So at the top end, 100% of the sand is passing through, and as the holes get smaller, you see less and less and less sand passing through that separator. So, for example, at the 50 screen size, I've got 15% of the sand mason sand passing through those holes, whereas 47% of number 8 sand is passing through. So that indicates that this type of sand has more fine particles. And fine particles are a red flag for us with sand management, because in a reclamation system,
I was going to say they'd be a nightmare.
we find it difficult to reclaim them because they're tiny. But also when they're in that type of sand is in the stall, it tends to compact. And this type of sand isn't very good for drainage. Again, drainage is key and very important to this process. So we have to be careful about choosing these types of sand. Visually, these look identical. If you just looked at a pile of these sands, you would not be able to tell the difference. But you put it through a screen, you realize one is quite different from the other. So you can graph this out, and this is from our good friend Kurt Gooch at Cornell. This is the mesh size here and the percentage of sand passing through. So the smaller holes, we see hardly any of the sand passing through. And as the holes get larger with a fine sand, you'll see more sand passing through, and it has a sort of S-shaped curve like that, whereas a higher grain sand, a concrete sand or mason sand, less sand will be passing through that finer mesh. And so you'll see this sort of higher grain, larger grain, coarser sand here, and then finer sands here. And for the most time, we're kind of trying to be in the middle here somewhere. That's the type of sand we're after. We don't want it to be so coarse that it is traumatizing the cow's foot.
Or causing more hair loss.
Causing a lot of hoof wear, causing hair loss over the hocks potentially and the knees. We'll see more knee hair loss in recycled sand herds. We'll see all this sort of jammed up in white line separations on the foot between the wall and the sole. We'll see this gritty material kind of stuck in there. So we want to avoid the super coarse high grain sand, but equally we want to try to avoid the very fine stuff, which will tend to compact, sit in the stall and prevent drainage. And so when you walk into a barn and you see a picture like this, that's not good sand. Yeah, you shouldn't see milk pooling on the top of your sand bedding. That's telling you that there isn't any very good drainage. Exactly. Yeah. So some of the things that we look for, we'll pick up the sand, put it through a sieve analysis, or just sort of visually inspect it. This is pretty much on the coarser side, so this would be typical sort of recycled sand, but you want uniform particles. You don't want to see sort of jagged pebbles in there. That's too much. Whereas here we see this really nice uniform even particle size sand, which is really excellent sand.
So then we've talked about the particles, what the size of the sand. What about how much of it is organic material? Yeah,
so we talked about type of sand, but you can also test the sand for organic matter and moisture level. So we want to maintain our sand at high levels of dry matter, so more than 95% dry matter. But also, particularly when we're reclaiming the sand and recycling the sand, we want to test that reclaimed material and make sure that we're at less than 4% organic matter. And that will take a specialized lab that will put this material through a heating process to get these numbers. Often soil testing labs will be able to do this for us. So
I've
similar
heard of
process.
Some vet clinics also offering this as well.
Yep. This can be done, and these are good things to monitor. Dr. Sandra Godden, she's done some research. She'd suggest maybe getting this organic matter down to less than 2%, which can be a little tough with some recycling systems. How do you fill the stalls?
Yeah, and how much sand do you plan per stall per day?
Absolutely. This sand's heavy, so you don't want to do this by hand. So we're usually dealing with a sand shooter system on a tractor or skid steer and just shooting the sand into the stalls. And we're going to typically do this once or twice a week. I would not go further than once a week. Some herds will like to do this maybe once every 2 weeks. I think that's a little bit of a push. Some get away with it, some don't, but I'd like to see once or twice a week.
Yeah.
If you've Only if you're only managing a small amount of sand over a pack mat or a conversion where there's a concrete base underneath, then definitely twice a week filling is required in those circumstances. But on average, we would see somewhere between 20 and 80 pounds of sand used per stall per day, with an average of around 50.
I think that's 22 kilograms.
Something like that. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm just testing myself with the metric
Just keeping
conversions.
our metric people happy. So yeah, typically about 50 pounds, 22 kilos of sand per stall per day would be something you'd budget around. And then with a pack mat, potentially half of that.
Okay. How does sand fill influence lying time behavior?
Once you put it in the stall and you see a sort of big pile there, then the cow's going to get in there and make
Dig
a little
herself
hole.
in?
Yeah,
No different than my cat going into his favorite blanket and
the little hamsters, they make these nests within the bed. So they push the sand underneath the loops and they make these little holes. Yeah, yeah. This is a little contour map of that. So the darker the color, the deeper the hole. And if you don't layer the bed, if you don't tend to the bed on a daily basis, those holes get deeper and actually you'll lose lying time. You lose about 1 hour of rest for every 3 inches of sand that's sort of dug out. So you don't want that to happen too much.
obviously you don't, because you love to optimize rest.
We need to optimize rest, so that means we need to level these beds on a pretty regular basis. Mm-hmm. You can do it manually. Smaller herds will do this with a garden rake, and you'll come in. And the key piece to know here is if you're going to rake the stalls, don't do it back and forth. Don't do it from the front to the back. What you want to do is grab the sand from underneath the loop. There's a big pile of sand that hasn't had a warm cow incubating on top of it. You want to drag that back diagonally, flush with the rear curb. Mm-hmm. That's the way we sort of teach people to level these beds. And you can actually see that in this picture, this sort of diagonal strokes of the rake through this bed. That's correct bed leveling, and this is it in action.
Yeah, and it looks great. Like if you need a workout,
it's hard. It's hard work. This is a 300-400 cow dairy. You can see people doing this with sort of 70-80 cow pens. Larger dairies, again, we've got to automate this process.
I was going to say, I know have figured out a solution to make this easier.
Yeah. This is my favorite sand leveling device. Some people just have a flat arm, with teeth maybe no deeper than about 4 inches. This one actually spins round and drags the sand pile from underneath the loop back onto the surface. And if I'm feeling stressed, I kind of like to
I was just
watch
going to
these
say,
things.
I have a feeling you sit in your office some days and just watch.
Just play this video. It's very
mesmerizing.
relaxing, and it's leveling the bed. It's dragging that unused sand from underneath the loop back onto the platform. If you've got wet material in the sand, you have to teach people what stays and what goes.
Okay.
Wet sand that's just arrived wet, or maybe a cow's peed on it, actually will drain. You can leave that stuff in the bed. It has low organics. It's not necessarily just to remove wet material. But if you've got fecal matter or milk mixed in with it, then obviously you've got organic material that will grow bacteria, and you need to recognize that type of material and remove it from the stall. Mm-hmm. So this is the juggle test. Yeah. So pick it up. We probably should be wearing a glove for this kind of thing, but if your caregivers, as they walk through the pens, can identify the areas with high amounts of organics, what you do is you make a ball and you juggle that ball, and if it stays in a ball, that's got a lot of organic matter stuck in it. If it just falls apart after one juggle, then it's just wet, and that material can stay in the stall. But if it stays in a ball, you need to remove it, because that's going to contribute to bacterial growth.
And what do you think could be causing more milk, more feces in the stalls? Anything to do with stall design?
Absolutely. It gets back to design, dimensions, the type of loop, the brisket locator construction, the neck rail placement, all these are really critically important for successful sand stall management.
Yeah, so just because you have sand doesn't mean it's going to work perfect. You got to look at the entire stall.
Yeah, and this notion that, everybody, 20 years ago when you put sand in, it was, well, sand's inert, You're not going to get mastitis from sand. Well, that's not exactly true.
Yeah, and you've seen a few not so nice looking
yeah, when you actually sort of
bases.
part the top inch or so and take a little closer look at what's happening underneath, you'll see the dreaded black sand, the black compaction zone.
So not the nice black sand. I don't know where it is in the United States, but you actually go and you want to see it. So you don't want to see it here.
Not that.
Oh, okay.
This stuff's nasty. It generally grows some weird strep-like organisms that it can actually cause mastitis when it gets close to the surface. Teach farmers to sort of, take a look for this and monitor that compaction zone.
Like how often are...
Yeah, just walking through the pens once a week or so, once every few weeks, just... take a closer look and see what's happening in the deeper layers. And if that compaction zone is within, 1 to 2 inches of the curb, then it's really likely that cow's going to be churning that deeper material up and it's going to be coming into contact with the cow's teats.
So you're saying you just can't add more sand bedding and make it deeper?
You can, but at some point you do have to address this. And so I'm going to take you back in time again, Courtney.
Snooze alert.
Yeah, an experience, our first experience of this. I'm going to take you back to a 300 cow dairy with a pretty horrific clinical mastitis problem, where a third of the clinical cases were due to Klebsiella. This is a gram-negative coliform type bacteria, caused very severe mastitis in some cases. And back then, Klebsiella was associated with wood products, with sawdust and shavings bedding. And this was a sand-bedded facility with the cleanest cows you'll see.
I'm sure you were scratching your head. Is that where some of the hair losses come from?
We're kind of looking at this. And so Dr. Jeff Renaud and his team had just started to offer bedding cultures from the Udder Health Lab at University of Minnesota, giving them a shout out. And so we collected sand bedding from this farm and sent it to the Udder Health Lab to get a report. And what we found was that the sand bedding was teeming with coliforms and Klebsiella. Who knew?
Who knew?
So as part of the troubleshooting on this farm, we actually saw an awful lot of streps as well. These environmental type streps, strep-like organisms. And so as part of the management of the mastitis on this farm was, well, one, to identify the chronic cows that we needed to remove that were potentially spreading infection to other cows, but to deal with the contaminated sand.
So how'd you do that?
Well, I can remember giving my farm report on this farm, and Robin and Lyle were sat there, and I was saying, well, the sand's dirty and it has to be removed. And I could tell they were not believing me. But he had done this before. So I'm there saying, you've got to empty 300 stalls because the sand's terrible. And I can remember Robin's jugular vein sort of pulsing away at the thought of having to do this. And I said, okay, I'm gonna have to do something here. I said, have you got a shovel?
Of course, every farm has a shovel.
Of course, they had a shovel. So I started to dig, and I dug down.
I thought this was a new yoga pose.
No, we took a close look. So we went out to the barn, we dug a hole, and we took a look. And this is kind of a little bit of archaeology on the dairy farm. You got to look. And so you can kind of see we're 18 inches down here, and we've got all manner of history of sand bedding on this farm. Here's the black zone. It's right at the top. So we had this horrible black compacted material. First time I'd ever seen it. First time these farmers had ever seen it. And we emptied the stalls.
The entire stall, not just the first part where the black was visible.
Went down quite a way, about a foot. Mainly the rear of the stall. The stuff in the front part of the stall is fine. It's usually the rear 2 feet that you're dealing with. And resolved the problem. That was our first experience in 2001. And then we visited a larger farm the next year, very similar kind of scenario. Mm-hmm. Lots of coliform mastitis, lots of problems. This farm, 1,400 cow dairy now, so bigger farm. I can remember, there are nearly 200 cow cases of mastitis in a month on this farm. I mean, just miserable.
Yeah.
And, Dr. Cook arrives on the farm and says, hey, we've got to empty 1,400 stalls.
Get out.
Mr. Popular. And so they did. They did. And this was a very fine, high clay or organic content sand, and it had compacted like stone. This was like chipping rock out of the stall. So not only was it a risk for bacterial growth, but it had taken a lot of the comfort away from these stalls because they were so hard. And within a month that we'd halved the clinical case rate from that stall emptying process, and it continued to decrease after that. And since that day, regular removal.
What is regular removal?
Yeah, every 6 months to 12 months, a lot of the farms that are using deep sand will check their beds and go through and remove the sand from these. One of the other things they can sometimes detect is an increase in mastitis on the last day before sand fill. So when you're at lowest sand in the stall, you will see a spike in clinical cases as that sort of the black zone gets close to the cow's teats. So we kind of look for that pattern when you plot out clinical cases by week. You can sometimes see these spikes at low sand fill, as you can see in this herd data.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, that's going to need some heavy equipment. Not going to do this by hand again. 1,400 stalls on that farm. You're going to rent a backhoe, or nowadays a lot of these farmers will have a device that they put onto their skid steers. They may share these things between 4 or 5 farms because you don't do it very often. And you go in and you remove the back 2 feet of sand out of the stall.
And is this something that can be done when the cows are out of the pen for milking?
Yeah, that's the idea, or at least moving the cows between the alleyways, the feed alley or the stall alley, so you can get in there and do this. But it's not a pleasant job, not a fun job.
Doesn't look like it.
But it's a necessary job if we're going to maintain high quality sand and for it to sort of deliver what we expect in terms of improved comfort, less lameness, higher milk production, and so on. So these are the secrets of sand management, the important steps that you have to take to do this well and to do it properly. And so choosing the right type of sand initially is very important, avoiding very fine material but also very coarse material. Monitoring dry matter and organic matter, particularly when you're recycling that material. Adding fresh sand once or twice a week. Making sure that you're using sufficient sand. That's important. Removing and recognizing the contaminated material, so removing the organics out of that stall on a regular basis, leveling the beds so that we're reusing that fresh sand that's been sort of pushed to the sides of the stall, getting that back onto the stall platform. And then monitoring the black zone, the compaction zone, and making sure that we're refreshing the sand on a regular basis. Again, it doesn't have to be done too often, but you need to keep an eye on it.
And so what I'm taking away from this is that sand is a very viable option for a lot of herds. There is some learning that has and change of management that goes along with the change, but obviously can still be implemented. I know there's a lot more resources on the Dairyland Initiative website.
There is, yeah.
And pictures. So if you're looking for more, feel free to check that out. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks.
The Dairyland Initiative is supported by industry leaders who are advancing cow comfort worldwide. We would like to say a special thank you to our premier sponsor, Saputo, who is providing the global community with high-quality dairy products made from high-quality milk from healthy and well-cared-for animals. We'd also like to say thank you to our other sponsors, SaveCows.com, Zinpro, GPS Dairy Consulting, 40 Barn, SureGain Trow Nutrition, Munters, J&D Manufacturing, VES Artex, Ventec, and Kestrel Instruments. Thanks for tuning in to the Dairyland Initiative podcast. Want more Dairyland Initiative? Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, follow us on our socials, and visit our website for all of the latest recommendations in dairy cattle housing and management. See you next time.